My guest today is Julian Guderley. Julian is the creator of Green Planet, Blue Planet podcast, which has over 300 episodes. The podcast is centralized around the theme of regeneration, positive planetary action, and systematic change. Julian is a leadership expert. He's a podcast producer, high-performing coach, and event creator. He's done over hundreds of events for the last 15 years on 3 different continents. Today, you guys are in for an absolute treat. We are going to talk about thinking in decades instead of days, and thinking about how you can gain control of your own life so that you can help lead yourself and lead others. You're in for an absolute treat today. I'm pumped about the show. Saddle up and get ready. Julian, welcome to the show, brother. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm excited, Jay. I'm doing well. What about you?
Dude, I'm having an awesome day. Now, we probably couldn't be further apart. So why don't you give the listeners a little background on, kind of who you are. I mean, I talked a lot about you in the intro, but kind of where you are, why you're there, and the whole 9 yards, man.
Sounds good. So I am recording this episode out of my childhood home in Bavaria in Germany. About every year or so, I make a travel back, visit the parents, visit the folks, and this happens to be while we're recording this episode. Usually, I live most of my year in Canada on Vancouver Island. And, I've over the years just become somewhat of a world traveler. So the last 2 decades now, since I'm 15, I've left home for the first time, lived in South America for a bit, and then, at some point made my way to North America. And so I can't really deny my roots. And I love coming back home to give my grandparents and my parents a good old hug. And so that's what brings me to Germany at this point in time.
Now, just for the listeners, because I'm sure very few have either been to Germany or know what's it like there right now. So we're recording this episode on, what is today, November the 22nd. What's the weather?
It's 22/11/22, right? So it's a cold and gnarly November day. Let's put it this way. I was just outside, walked the dog, and watched a beautiful sunset. But it's freezing cold. We're close to 0 Celsius, and it's winter, so it's probably going to be one of those to light a fire in the fireplace later tonight, and it's cozy vibes all around. That's what's going on right now. Yeah.
Awesome. Before we dive into kind of what you're doing today, walk me through what it's like, being little Julian growing up in Germany, and then how do we decide one day, hey, you know what? I'm ready to roll. Like I'm ready to go do something different. 'Cause that's a big swing. You know what I mean? How did you get to that place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, little Julian, the way he grew up, I got to say, I think in the global context of all the different ways of growing up, I grew up in a very privileged and protected kind of, bubble. Well loved by my family, my sister, my parents, my grandparents that I already mentioned. Lots of friends living in walking distance. I grew up right next to a forest. And just a beautiful natural area. And so until I was about, 10, 11, 12, I didn't really think about the world out there all too much. I was born in 87. So for those of you who were born around that same time-ish, well, or before, you know how it was. Like there was no tech toys. There's not even a Game Boy. There was no PlayStation, no computer, no internet. So we played outside, man. I mean, what I did was come home from school and throw my backpack in the corner and not think of tomorrow, and just kick a soccer ball or run in the forest and bring my friends and build little dams in rivers and stuff like that. I mean, rivers, really, they were like little creeks. But
is it Bavaria? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, you're saying that right. That's the southern half of Germany, I guess. It's one of the states / provinces / departments in Germany, and so it's a beautiful area. It's like rolling hills. It's quite a bit of ways from the Alps where I grew up particularly. And so, the Alps would be the major mountains in Europe. And so it was just a lot of outdoor time. And then right around 12, 13, 14, and I think that is really relevant to share, there was something that happened to me. It was like now 20 years later, I would call it like a a aha moment, or like almost a spiritual awakening of like first degree in that sense. And to anyone who's familiar with Rudolf Steiner, the founder of Waldorf schools, they would know what I'm talking about. In 7 year cycles, our development happens, especially as kids, but actually throughout all of our life. And so right around 12, 13, 14, right when that second 7 year cycle ended, I had this distinct and really clear notion of, I want to go abroad. And don't ask me where it came from. It was just, that's why I call it like an aha moment, or like a, low level spiritual awakening, in the sense that I just knew there was something I had to do. And
Yeah.
long story short, I ended up in Paraguay in South America, which, if you've ever been there, and you've been to Germany too, it couldn't be more opposite to each other.
Right.
So like, I grew up in a beautiful, I call it like a protected bubble. But I also grew up in a very industrialized country, right? Germany, just like the States at large, is highly industrialized. It's, everything is run like a machine. Things, quotation marks, they work. Not that as a kid I took note of that a lot, but when I went to Paraguay, there's a few elements that happened to me. One was I had to go into just like hyperdrive, like quantum learning, right? I learned Spanish and Portuguese and a whole bunch of English in that year. I met like hundreds, if not thousands, of new people. I lived in a host family for a year. Bless their hearts, they were really kind, really sweet to me. But culturally speaking, it was just day and night. It was so different from Germany. And the reason why I still like to share that story, and thanks for asking me, Jay.
Yeah.
The reason why I like to share that story is because it flipped my worldview upside down. And when I returned to Germany after a full year of being immersed in the country of Paraguay, and learning Spanish actually to fluency, and doing school there, and doing all the things a teenager does at age 15, 16, that's when I actually ended up there. I had a massive cultural shock, not when I went there, when I came back home,
Okay.
because I realized that a lot of the adults in the world around me, they didn't quite have that life experience of living in another country, of accepting different kind of habits, different kind of cultural, just ways of being. And so yeah, I had this massive cultural shock, because I realized Germany as this industrialized country, again, where quotation marks, things just work. The train's on time, and if it's 2 minutes late, people are upset. I could feel that people were fundamentally not happy. They weren't loving. They weren't kind. They weren't, I mean, I'm generalizing, but they weren't
Right.
really living life in a way that I just experienced in this South American family, in this tribe of people that was ultimately living a pretty simple life. But their value of family and their value of just being with each other was so much higher than any other values of their daily life. And so that really stuck with me. And that is something I don't think I ever let go of in these last 20 years. And I realized that, maybe that's also what kept me going and kept me traveling and living in other countries, is that we as humans are fundamentally connected through the love and the care we gift each other.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if the train is late, or, if things happen the way you planned them, because the connection we have through kindness, love, and simply being with each other is worth, at least to me, a lot more than it is to just live in a machine-like world.
Yeah, two things popped up for me. Was this to go abroad, or to leave your country and go on like an exchange type thing? Was that normal? And I'm using normal, I'll use quotations. Like, was that something that hey, oh, my friend did this a few years ago, or this is something that your culture is used to doing? And then secondarily, whenever you came back at that age, that's a really eye-opening thing for such a young person to be able to fundamentally to be aware of. Did it make you want to stay, or did it make you want to go? Like, what were your feelings when you got that? So first and foremost, was it normal or traditional to go abroad, or was this kind of like a Julian thing? You're like, hey, I'm
Yeah.
ready to roll.
Yeah, man. I mean, that is a great question. I think at large, it's becoming a lot more normal nowadays.
Yeah.
But still, it is a very, it is a very special thing to do for any teenager. And I do highly recommend it if that isn't, your in the field of possibilities around you. Back when, this was like 2003 when I actually left, I was obviously not the first person to do that. Out of my high school year, I think it was me and one other person.
Okay.
Most Germans went to the US. It was kind of a special thing to go to South America at that age group. South America being the big unknown, I guess.
Right.
I was just ready and excited and looking forward, but I remember my mom was frightened, right? Like she was just like, oh my God, like what are we saying yes to? And yeah, I kind of wish that this was almost like normalized to the point that everyone gets to experience it, because there is some kind of emancipation that happens in a year like that. And the whole teenage kind of time, I have quite a bit of a different experience than most kids had at the time, because I had to deal with topics of life at that age. I was still protected. I did have a host family that did take good care of me, but there was just a different set of possibilities available. That second part of the question, yeah, when I got back home, it definitely encouraged me to keep going. I think, and this is something that shows up a lot in my work today, in the coaching I do, in the events I host, even in the podcast I host, is this notion of what can I do to lead myself to embrace experiences that actually support me, that actually allow my spirit, my personality, my ability to engage in life, that increase those possibilities, right? Like, what can I do to lead myself? And then the secondary piece there is, when you step into the unknown, you have to embrace what's there. There's very little planning. There's very little knowing beforehand. And so it really sharpens your present moment awareness. And so, I found it was a huge gift. Again, I had quite a bit of a backlash when I arrived back in my home culture, because I realized this might not be for me. And this is maybe the third through line here, is that like that feeling, and I'm sure you've had that in your life before too, Jay, is like, wait, is this it? Is there more? Yeah. That was a feeling I was really left with. Wait, is this it? Is there more? Right. And so when I came back home, I was like, this was nice. I want more of what I just tasted. And in this life around me, like stand in line, finish school, go to university, get a well-paying job. I kind of, I tried this for a little bit, but I kind of felt like this can't be it, right? Like this isn't what all the adults do, just to figure out, getting a well-paying job. And then that's the end of the line until you're 65 and yada, yada, yada. So basically like it left me with a big thirst for more. Yeah.
It sounds like it gave you like a sense of awareness, like to the, to not just the world that you had grown up in, but like that there was just a differentiation of different places. And like, you said the word emancipation, like you grew up probably a lot during that transitional year.
Yeah, I was definitely an idiot teenager also, like no question.
Well, I mean, let's my hands up in the air. I mean, like who was
it? Both hands up in the air here. But besides that, like you're definitely right. There was an element of growing up and an element of understanding certain similarities that all people, of all backgrounds, as long as they're humans, that we share, that became really present to me. And also an ability to read between the lines. So when I came back to Germany back in the day, I had to finish 2 more years of school, and it, I'm happy that I did finish school, and I'm happy that I was, blessed with the education I had, but it just felt meaningless to me compared to all of the lessons that life have. And so many of the teachers back in the day, they didn't have that worldview. And so I realized, okay, there are going to be a whole group of adults with whom I cannot have these kind of conversations, even though in theory, when you grow up, you think they're adults, they should know, but they really simply didn't know because they didn't have the life experience. And so it did teach me a few things about life that, yeah, man, I mean, I just had to figure them out by myself and keep going.
I love human psychology. So my brain just went to the place where, were you able to articulate the differentiations when you came back, or was it just like an awareness? Like you knew things were different, but you weren't, you know what I'm talking about? You couldn't put a finger on it, but you knew just things like this is just different. Or were you really able to kind of articulate the differentiations in the culture? And then in doing so, did you try to have conversations like even with your family, like, hey, mom and dad, like we're too rigid, or we're too this, or we're too that, or did you kind of keep it to yourself?
Mm-hmm. Did you just pick the rigid out of the German prejudice box?
No,
no, you'd be right
not
on.
At all.
I'm joking, but hey, man. So the truth is, now 20 years later, I'm much more able to articulate that.
Okay.
When I was a teenager, I think there was just a lot going on. I wouldn't have even called it like a spiritual awakening in that sense. I know though at this point that it definitely was, because life has these ways of how to make itself present to us, right? Like the exposure to the Guarani people and the native indigenous people of Paraguay at the time was a total blessing that took me a decade or so to really understand that that's what happened, that I encountered original people in a way that you barely can in any other country. And so no, I wasn't really fully able to articulate it. I had this deep sense that something shifted that was just irrevertible. And so I understood that, and this comes back to leading yourself. I understood that I had to keep going, and that
Yeah.
in life you can't always ask for permission, because most of the time the only person you have to ask for permission from is yourself anyway,
Yeah.
right? And so yeah, truth be told, I was definitely still in teenager mode for a few different years, but deep down there was also just like a certain kind of wisdom that was arising. And someone back in the day encouraged me to start writing a journal, and so I did. Since around about the age of 14, I started journaling and writing
Cool.
things down and reflecting on things in written form. And I have those old journals, and when I go through them, it's quite fascinating. It's like 2-3 pages of like teenage gibberish. I did this, I went there on the weekend, we had X amount of beers, and this girl was cute, and what about that one? And then you flip the page, and then suddenly there's this like divine poetry, and I'm like, did I write this?
Right.
Oh, I must have been the one writing this. And so what I'm trying to say here is that through the writing, I could see that there's kind of like different elements of myself that came alive, right? So like the personality self, and then the deeper, more aware, more present part of the self that is, connected to all things.
Yeah, this kind of brings me full circle. Like in our pre-chat, you mentioned like thinking in decades and not days. And now I think I get it more so after hearing you just kind of explain that. It's like when you can expand your horizon and your perspective, it really changes how things are, or it changes how you see things, right?
Yeah, big time. I mean, thinking in decade, not days, is a major access to dreaming your dream into reality. Let me elaborate on that a little bit. So, some of the most powerful people in the world, it doesn't matter if we deem what they do as good or bad, but they do think in decade and not days. And that's how a lot of their goals actually end up coming true. Because most people are stuck in the day-to-day, in the week by week, or like maximum, and they're like, what am I going to achieve in this year, right? Like, how people, especially in the fitness space, struggle with just like New Year's resolutions. You have them for January 1st, you do them for 2 weeks, and then you're like, oh, down already. But what about that 10-year vision of your health? What about that 10-year vision of your well-being? And so the number one thing that clicked for me, this is pre-Google Maps, by the way. Like, I didn't have a tablet in my hand. I was sitting there in Paraguay in the little room that they had for me. And I was actually opening a book, with, a map in it, a world map in it. And I was like, whoa, Germany, Paraguay. And so it dawned on me that like my dream from a year prior became true. Right? So what you dream into the field, what you dream into the space, can become true when you take the actions and the consequential steps to meet life in the process of dreaming. So that's kind of like one piece of it, is like dare to dream, and then dare also to make those consequential steps. But when you think in decades and not days or weeks, what becomes possible is so much more, because you have suddenly kind of, it's almost like you're going through an element of timelessness, because you're realizing that goals might take longer, or they might also be realized faster. But even if they take longer, your commitment, your determination, your access to them doesn't waver. And so that's the main difference between thinking in decade, not days. And I'll add one piece there. And it's when you, no matter how old you are, when you envision yourself 20, 30, 40 years later, like let's say, I'm 35 at this moment as we're recording, what would my 65-year-old version say in this interview? What is that deeper inner wisdom that I have access to today when I just slow down, take a few deep breaths, and connect to? Because in a certain way, many of us know this, time is an illusion, right? Like when you talk to a lot of, elders, and you realize in their world, lots has changed. The body has aged, time has passed, but that element that is the true inner self, that hasn't changed since they're a teenager, right? Like
Right.
many people say, oh, I still feel like when I was 20 years
Yeah,
old. And that is because that inner part of ourselves is just present. It is absolutely timeless. And so that's, I believe, one of the beauties of thinking in decade, not days, is to realize that, this is your life. This is your time to become an active dreamer of the dream of life, rather than living a dream that was dreamt for us.
totally. Yeah, kind of removing some of that programming that was put into us at an early age. Like you said earlier, I mean, it struck a chord with me because I so believe that, like, set in straight lines, raise your hand when the bell rings, go here. It's like such a utilitarian approach
Mm.
to life, and that's really no way to live. I mean, that's not living, right? You're just kind of like functioning as a robot in somebody else's system. And so I think when you can think in decades and not days, and such a great concept. And I personally do the exact same thing. It's like, I don't believe in finish lines. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to get
Mm.
to where it is that I think I want to go right now, because I know once I get closer, I'm going to expand that horizon and
Exactly.
keep evolving and growing. And, you do a lot of leadership coaching. And so I'm sure you're consistently, trying to drive this point home, because the world we live in today is very instant gratification, right? The push of a
Yeah.
button, and you know, I can order from Amazon and the guy shows up before I even finish my transaction. So we live in the most bizarre, because like you and I grew up, like you said, no internet, no video games, no cell phones, no anything. It's like there was no push of anything. Like if you wanted something done, you had to get up and go do it, even to change the TV. And so, I mean, you might have grown up with a remote control, but I was born in the 70s. So there was no remote controls. I was the remote
Dial on the
control.
TV.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that was me.
Well, the thing with the 10 years, right, is also, or the decades, is that you become aware that, well, that is a long time ahead of me. So maybe it is possible
Yeah,
to plant a garden. Maybe it is possible to raise my kids the way I want to raise my kids, right?
totally.
So the possibility field widens, and with that, often what holds us back, the procrastination, the discouragement, the things we do that keep us away from our dreams. When we think in decades, there's literally nothing that separates us from any achievement.
Yeah, 1,000,000% agree. I think that goes back to when we're in that instant gratification moment, like especially, with social media and all those things,
Mm,
it's like we're looking for that, like that hit of dopamine immediately. And when we don't get it, we think of, well, this must have failed, or I must
yeah,
suck, or this wasn't worth it. Or, there's a laundry list of the negative programming that we've allowed to dictate our own behaviors.
big time.
And I think, like, I love what you do with the whole leadership thing, and the post that you put on social media a couple of days ago about, the number one rule of being a lifeguard, right? Is like, you can't save
Mm,
somebody else if you're drowning. Like, whenever you put that, I like to get into psychology. Like, when you put that
mm.
post up, was it just like, this is a pretty cool post, or were you kind of like thinking in terms of like personal leadership, or something that you're doing or whatnot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thinking in decade, not days, is one of those, paradigm changing principles. Leading oneself is another one. And you said it, the lifeguard, that is an example. In airplanes, when they show you the little video at the beginning
Yeah.
of any flight, that you got to put that air mask, if it happens to drop, on your own face first before you can even help the child next to you, is another one of those. I'll give you another example. When, unless you're in school, but if you need to go to the bathroom, you won't ask anyone for permission, right? But how about your biggest dream, or, the vision you had as a 6 or 7 year old? Like, why is it that people wait for permission or acknowledgement from other people rather than giving themselves the acknowledgement to say, wait a second, this is in my inner dreaming field. This is in my consciousness. Maybe
Yeah.
this is meant for me. And so we don't necessarily need to ask for permission. In fact, I would dare to say there is no need to ask for permission at all. Now, given, of course, that you don't hurt someone else in the process of what you're creating, but we become so much more powerful when we stand in integrity and in determination and commitment to our own dreams. Again, I would use the Toltec wisdom here as my crutch. Um, Don Miguel Ruiz is one of the authors that wrote about this quite a bit. He's the author of the Four Agreements, or now the Five Agreements. And, the Toltec wisdom talks about there's a dream that is dreamt for us. You called it programming, or, the world and the powers in the world that currently are. And then there is the process of awakening to becoming a dreamer in this world, meaning that the dreams that are within your own field, the things that happen to you when you sit in deep meditation, or the ideas you get when you're without your cell phone, alone in nature, or you're doing the ice bath, or whatever it is you're doing, and you're realizing, I see this vision. Those are our dreams, right? And so when we want those to become real, no one will lead us there,
Right.
other than ourselves. And so, we have to be the ones that lead ourselves. And the lifeguard example is just like a metaphor. And I think that's why, why I made the post is because in those metaphors, people can often see it. But really what leadership coaching for me is helping people to not just see it and understand it, but then to realize it. And I mean realize in the actual meaning of the word, to making it real, right? We all have a dream or several dreams inside of us. And many of us wait way too long to act on them, or wait until the end of their life and then say, the circumstances were never favorsome. But, this is another one that we get from the first principle, which is think in a decade, not days. Well, things do go wrong sometimes. So becoming resilient and being able to, actually work and create an integrity often means clean up, reflect, learn, and try again, right? And so when we look at professional athletes, for example, that's what they do all day long. Like, you can't miss a shot in the first quarter of a basketball game and then say, coach, I need to leave the field. Like, I missed that shot. No, you bounce back. You take a few deep breaths and you go for the next shot, right? And so it's very similar with all pursuits in life. And so unless we lead ourselves to that, and that can be very simple. The example could be that you work for a company and you have no compensation structure for a bonus, for example, on your work contract. So if you want that in there, you got to talk to your to your employer and say, hey, I'd love to talk with you about that compensation structure. I think it's time that we find that in writing. And so those are very simple examples, or that's a very simple example to say, look, no one will do this for you unless you dare to have that conversation.
Yeah. I find this a lot in my world, is that people ask for permission when they should be asking for support.
Yes, that's it.
It's really radical. It blows my mind. It's like, we'll have somebody who is ready to take that leap and like get, they're in a health crisis and they want to lose weight and they want to get off medications and they want to transform their body. And then they always revert to, well, I want to check with my significant other and make sure this is okay. Mm-hmm. And I always pause and say, I'll say, Keith, like, it sounds to me like you're asking for permission when you should be asking for support. Mm-hmm. Like, we shouldn't have to ask for permission to win for ourselves. You know what I mean? And I think we've gotten locked into a weird, I'm going to use the word programming again. Yeah. Give me your perspective on that.
Well, I'm fully with you, Jay. I think the word programming is really fitting. Again, I will use the framework of the dream that is dreamt by others for us. So most people that went to a regular school, not everyone did, but probably most people listening to this did go to a regular school. And so in that school, we're separated by age groups, simply to compare ourselves to everyone else in the same age group and perform to always who is the best, right? It's like a pure comparison game. And if we don't know, then we're told to be silent, to sit down, and to repeat. And so it really discourages our spirit, our innate birthright of living in exploration, living in curiosity, living in the process of life, not in the perfection of life. And so that's a big step in that programming, or in that dream that is dreamt for us, is that we're being discouraged to embrace natural processes of life. And in that natural process of life, which I would summarize with the word curiosity or the word experimentation, when we get encouraged to do so, then asking for support becomes a natural second. And many of us learn this as adults. Many of us learn this through self-development or leadership practices. Yeah. Some of us learn this with our friends or even from our parents, but most people don't ever learn this. And so, there's this culture of stand in line, 2 meters distance from each other, and don't ask questions, right? And so that's very unfortunate, because I do believe that following the idea of curiosity and experimentation, which is innate in all children, so much more is possible. Now, I'm not saying that that's an open playing field without any boundaries.
Right.
Boundaries are important, just like support is important. But, without digressing into education there too much, I think it has a lot to do with the way we grow up. And I think that's why we see more and more parents trying to find a way how to get their kids out of the regular schooling system.
Yeah, agreed. You said something in that post. It was you listed the 5 symptoms of not leading yourself, and the number 5 kind of goes right in line with what we're talking about. It's prioritizing other people's well-being ahead of ourselves. I find that a lot too. Like I find people saying, well, like they'll put everybody else's health and wellness and even financial wellness and health in front of their own, and then they lead a life of, overwhelm, anxiety, depression, not being as happy as they should be, but they continually do that because they've been trained or taught that that's the way of the world. Like, how do you move somebody from that place, out of that place, into a place of personal, leadership?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are many different ways, right? So in my work, we host both in-person experiences like immersions, or formerly often called retreats. I don't love the word retreat as much, but it's ultimately that, like a week where you change the environment, you go to a place that is much more conducive, you create winning circumstances for people, and you help them liberate through different experiences. Full disclosure, in some of my retreats, we also call on the allies of plant medicines that can help quite a bit to deprogram or to purge out old, stuck beliefs that are in the system. When that's the event work. In the interpersonal work or the online coaching programs I run, what we focus on is, first of all, is that bottom line acknowledgement for how we've come to the place that we're in right now. Because most of us, because we went through these schooling systems that basically just acknowledge us if we are in peak performance. So if we get good grades, we get acknowledged. If we don't, then, well, shit out of luck, you didn't make it, right? And so many of us walk around with this like big wound inside of us that is like, I want to be acknowledged for who I am. And so I truly believe that everyone does deserve that. But for me, that is the starting place, right? And then from there, it is about understanding what is this unique dream that lives inside of you, and how do you actually embrace that in a daily way, right? Again, I believe resilience is a big piece of it, because not everything will always go right, but the ability to bounce back is a pivotal piece of coming, kind of around, from not living your full power into continuously getting out more of your power and embodying all of it. Yeah. I also believe devotion is a big piece of it. So non-denominational, I personally don't care in which way somebody practices devotion, but devotion for me is a non-dogmatic practice of a reverence for life itself. That could happen through meditation, it could happen through nature walks, it could happen through prayer, even through journaling. But if we don't have respect for life and the process of life, it's very, very difficult to actually connect to the lever that allows us to move into higher spheres of performance. There's quite a bit more to it, but those would be the first ones I would start with. Yeah.
That's awesome. One of my quests and one of my, I feel like one of my life's purposes and passions is to help other people like live theirs. You know what I mean? To see that there's like, you can really be, do, and have anything that you desire if you're willing to go after it. Why do you think we've been stifled so much in the quest of our own dreams? I mean, the quote you gave a while ago by Don Miguel Ruiz is spot on, but like in layman's terms, in your perspective, because I see it almost every single day. I see somebody that I know has a dream that they're almost even unwilling to talk about it. You know what I mean? They just keep it inside and they stifle it and they push it down and down and down. And I think that leads to more chaos and more overwhelm and more, angst. Like what are your thoughts around that?
The big why, like why is that so?
Yeah. I mean, why do you think we do that? Like, why do you think more of us aren't willing to go after the things that, the dreams that you talked about that we said that, people want, but they're unwilling to actually pursue them?
Yeah, I do think, we already kind of touched on it. It is the underlying conditioning, the programming it is about how we actually get, I'll use some esoteric terms here, loved into being. What I mean with that is how we get encouraged to be who we truly are. And so when we look at this world, and I'll point at the schooling system, but it's the same in work culture, everything is based on competition. And I don't believe that that is actually the highest state of our species. Now, I'm not saying competition is wrong. I'm not saying competition doesn't have some good elements to it, but I don't think we actually live in a field of competition. And so when you get primed that competition is everything there is, then for a lot of people, it is much more convenient to say, you know what? I'm not even going to compete because I'm afraid that I'm not going to succeed. I'm afraid that I'm not going to make it to number one. I'm afraid that this isn't going to be right. And so the fear of competing is a big block. The fear of doing the wrong thing. Again, in the schooling system, if you don't know the right answer, what's the consequence?
Yeah.
You usually don't get encouraged. You get told that you're dumb, or you get an F or a 6 or whatever the grading system is in your country. And so, it's very discouraging for a lot of people. And we see this a lot in the work with plant medicines. A lot of the deep trauma in people, it always goes back to childhood. It always goes back to the way we grow up. And so I think, just like in the natural world, in us and around us, to me, it seems like there is a highly complex system of synarchy going on. And what that means is there is like a synergistic collaboration going on. And within that collaboration, there are different layers or tiers of competition as well. But competition is only one of the elements of how the natural world, again, including us humans, interacts. So as long as we have the main focus of how we build society and of how we bring up young people, the main focus on competition, I think we will always stifle the many and only further the few. And so that to me is by design. Your question was, why is that so? Well, by design, because if you have millions and millions of people in a country, it's so much easier to control them or maneuver them if you fundamentally make them afraid of their own potential. If you fundamentally tell them that, if you follow the rules, your life's going to be better, right? And so I don't play by the rules, I play with the rules. And that's what I help people to understand is like rules are a guideline. Again, we're talking about the larger playing field of as long as you don't hurt a third party while you're creating what you're creating, then what I'm saying I believe is true. And that is that rules are yours to play with, so you can create and often in a collaborative way or in a synarchic way, which would mean in an interplay, right? In an interrelation with people around you. And then competition can be nice, because if team A and team B, work together with each other, but then they also play against each other to see who does it in an even more genuine way, that's kind of where all of these different layers come to play. But I think the fundamental reason why, and that was your question, is because it's by design. There's a large benefit for few people, and that's, at least until now, has been the dominant paradigm on this planet.
Yeah, I'm big on definitions, and I encourage everybody to, define life on your terms instead of using societal or other people's terms. Two things came up when you were talking about that competition element that keeps people kind of stuck from living their dreams. And it was, I don't know if you'd call it the twin brother or maybe the step brother, but with competition comes that comparison thing. And I think that's what people spend a lot of time comparing themselves to others, either prematurely or not comparing the same, context of information. And that keeps them stuck in that world of like, well, this person, there's no way I could ever do that because I don't have what they have versus.
Let's make a short example there, Jay. I love what you're bringing up, because you're right. Like competition and comparison are like, maybe they're close cousins, but maybe they're twins. You might be right that they're actual twins. Like, a great example would be, and this goes probably for every single person listening, we as humans usually love music, right? Rhythm, like our heartbeat is a rhythm. We operate within the rhythm of nature. Our fertility cycle, especially in the body of females and women, the fertility cycle is a cycle for a reason, right? But we are connected to these cycles of nature, the moon, the waters in our body, the waters of the planet, the rhythm of our heart, etc., etc. Now, in different cultures, often in the global south, people grow up with a lot more rhythm embodied, and like music and dancing is part of their life. But generalizing, almost every human being loves to move their body, sing, or make any form of rhythmic movement or drumming. But most of us barely ever express this on a daily basis because, as you just said, if you compare yourself to the Grammy Award winning artist,
Right.
well, then maybe you didn't make the cut and you're just not as musical. Or maybe, you know, when you were 6 years old, someone in school said, your voice sucks. And so you're not as musical. But actually, I don't believe that's true. I believe that we are fundamentally more joyful when we express these really basic, you know, gifts of the human body and of the human soul. And so, yeah, for me, music is often one of the key examples when it comes to comparison and competition, because you don't have to be the best at music to experience massive amounts of joy from
Yeah.
singing or drumming or dancing.
Yeah. I got kicked out of sixth grade choir and I still sing. So,
There you go. Nice.
so what what are you going to do? Sometimes you just got to, it is what I agree with you though. I mean, you were talking about all that. That's such a great analogy. It's like, you're right. It's like, in beauty, or the sound of the beauty is in the ear or eye of the beholder as well. You know what I mean? Like,
And joy especially, right? So that's kind of
yeah,
the point I'm trying to make here, is that not everything, and probably most anything, needs to be done for being the best person at it. Now again,
yeah,
there is a place for that, and I'm not trying to talk that place into shits, but that shouldn't be the only motivation at
yeah,
all, right? So if you're really good at something, to then say, you know what, why don't I compete and see how good I really am at that? Go for it. I think that's great. But for most people, because we are 8 billion people on there, like let's take running, right? There's only one fastest runner out of 8 billion
right,
people. Should that mean that no one else should get joy out of running? No, of
right.
course not, right? So receiving joy from an activity simply for the sake of receiving joy from an activity, that for me is the key, right? And again, that's leading yourself of realizing, oh boy, I like singing. Well, why don't I
Yeah,
do it more often?
yeah.
Well, let me do it more often. And then the chances are you raise your vibration because you suddenly feel good. And because you suddenly feel better, you now have access to the next set of possibilities based on simply being more, or being closer to them vibrationally speaking.
Absolutely. The last point I want to touch on is this, and I think this is a great way to wrap it up, because I think a lot of people are stuck hiding, but I'm going to use that phrase and then I'll unpack it. They're hiding behind the idea of perfectionism, or
Mm-hmm.
waiting for the perfect time or the perfect scenario or the perfect day or the perfect whatever it is. I personally don't believe in perfect. Like, I mean, what are your thoughts and perspectives on that, on that whole waiting, or thinking, when things are perfect, then I'll be happy, Julian. Then I'll go after what I want to do.
When things are perfect. Yeah. Well, perfection is such an interesting one, right? So I believe that, either everything is already perfectly, deliciously as it should be, or nothing ever is going to be perfect,
There you go.
right? So, you pick your battle here. But basically, I'm in agreement with you, Jay, that it is really not about waiting until circumstances are perfect. Now, there are winning circumstances, there are
Yeah.
better moments to do things, and there are worse moments to do things. But if you always wait and never take action, that is the worst course of action that could happen, right? So, yeah, perfectionism, total game stopper. I really believe that avoidance and procrastination and this mentally perceived perfectionism is what stops most people from living their dreams. And I would encourage listeners and anyone who's gotten anything out of this episode to really check yourself. Where in your life is that maybe still true? Where you have a dream, you have a desire, you're maybe kind of possibly wanting to, but you're letting that idea that you're just not good enough yet stop yourself. Now,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that everything should just be winged and done without
Right.
rehearsing. Obviously, not the opposite is true. But very often, when we take a first step, we learn from that first step, which helps us to take the second step. And then we learn from the second step, right? And maybe full circle here to what I shared earlier about decades, not days. Now, thinking in decade, not days, does not mean to leave the present moment. It means that when you have the time to reflect, think in decades, set your goal in decades, but always come back to that one right next step in front of you. And for that right next step, you don't need more perfect circumstances. In
Right.
fact, you probably already know what that is. If that is going downstairs to make dinner, which is very likely my next step after this episode, or if that is sending that email, or if that is, calling that friend that you haven't called in 10 years, go do it. Don't wait for perfect, and lean into life, because life is really worth living. And the process of living is the process of trial and error. That's why I said earlier, curiosity is innate in all human beings. And I do believe that the process of curiosity plays itself out in experimenting. And experimenting, that means sometimes things go right, sometimes they go wrong. But if you don't experiment, you'll be on the sidelines forever.
Totally agree. Dude, you are an absolute rock star, man. We could probably jam and rap for another hour. So tell everybody, tell us about the podcast. Where can we listen? I mean, obviously all the major things, but tell us the name, what it's all about, and then the best place for somebody to follow you if they just want a little boost of Julian in their day.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Jay, for the plug. So my podcast is called Green Planet, Blue Planet podcast, and it's on all the major podcast apps, Spotify and Apple Podcasts mainly. I've been doing this for 5 years, so there's about 317 episodes out there. Jay, you'll be one of the next guests coming on.
Awesome.
At large, the podcast is about all things regeneration and self-leadership. So tune into that podcast. It's also greenplanet-blueplanet.com. And check out my Instagram. So it's, my full name, Julian Guderley. On Instagram, there's all kinds of links for the next events. I think the next one coming up is early 2023 in Mexico. A beautiful experience. And then after that in Brazil. So, I am still the global traveler that I have been since age 15. So if someone feels called into exotic places and wants to really level up their life, hit me up. I do read my own DMs, so send me a direct message there, or find my email on the website, and let's be in touch.
Awesome. And guys, I will link every bit of that in the show notes, so you don't have to type frantically or do all that stuff. So just go to the show notes. There'll be all the links. You'll be able to find Julian really easy. Julian, thank you so much, brother, for spending the time with me.
Thank you, Jay. This was a pleasure.
All right, man. I'll see you soon. Hey, before you go, I'd just like to say thank you again for listening to the Thrive Forever Fit podcast and watching on YouTube. It means the absolute world to me. And if you would do me one favor, and that is simply subscribe and review this podcast on whatever platform it is that you enjoy it on, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, doesn't matter. I would absolutely be so grateful and so thankful if you do that for me. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you again next week with an awesome episode. Bye.